Welcome to Fringe Pop 321, the show that believes the world is stranger than we think, but thinking should not be strange. We're back with Dr. Jud Burton, and we were talking about vampires. And the last time we talked, we got into the distinction between literary vampires and cultural anthropological vampire stuff. So for our audience, can you talk a little bit about that distinction? And then I want to go into, really the literary stuff and how that sort of has led to the formation of how we think about this subject.
Certainly. The idea of the vampire is a perennial, but it's culturally specific. It occurs according to a set of a sort of cultural doctrine, if you will, cultural conditions, cultural ideology. And that makes it a distinct, although again not altogether unrelated idea from the literary vampire.
Do you think the literary, Bram Stoker is about the only one I'm familiar with, did he just sort of sit down and sort of aggregate ideas, or how did this work?
In many ways, that's what he did. And it's the novel itself, Dracula, which stands out, even to this day as the standard, is very much an aggregation. It's a rich tapestry of all kinds of things. He's got, of course, the combination of a historical figure. You've got these elements from Eastern European folklore, and you also have elements that he's taking from other writers to an extent. Stoker was also influenced by the stage manager for the theater that he worked for. In many ways, he patterned parts of Dracula's demeanor after this guy who was.
That's nice.
And he's such a bad dude that he. And I understand that one of my forebears as well, Sir Richard Francis Burton, visually was one of the influences on how Dracula was depicted in the novel.
Do you think that Stoker knew any of the ancient material? We talked a little bit last time. Maybe the Greco-Roman stuff because of sort of a classical education.
Sure.
So you could say that there's some research put into this, but in terms of the classical material, because we talked last time about the draining of the life force, the metamorphosis, the shape-shifting, and that sort of thing. And then, again, this is just my impression, he marries that to this aggregation of, folklore that he would be more immediately familiar with as a European. And then he does his own thing, he adds his own elements to it. Is that, are we getting...
That's pretty accurate,
yeah.
During that time, a classical education, if you were availed of an education, you had been exposed to that sort of material at one point or another, the classical, the ancient material. And so he's taking what he's learned from scholarly articles, from books about the region, the history of the region, the folklore of the region, and combining them into what becomes the grand exemplar in many ways for all other literary vampires.
So how does this relate to Vlad Tepes?
Vlad Tepes was a 15th century Romanian prince. He ruled an area of Romania called Wallachia. And one of the methods by which Vlad used to deter the Turkish onslaught, the Ottomans were in the process at the time of making inroads into Europe. And in many ways, Vlad and some of his contemporaries were given the charge of defending the frontier.
Right.
And one of the means by which he chose to try and deter the Turks, as it were, was to impale not only the Turks, but some of his other political enemies on stakes. And in some cases, large numbers of them in the courtyards of his castles.
Why would he do it in his castles? Is that in case they were stormed, or is that just sort of to keep order in-house?
Well, it served multiple purposes, knowing the Machiavellian nature of Vlad, and he was very much that. It would have served a number of purposes, but I think especially would have been directed at the Turks. And of course, you have to sift through the propaganda of the period. There are a lot of, Saxon and German pamphlets and woodcuts that are made at the time that probably accurately depict these forests of stakes. That's where one of them actually depicts him dining amidst this forest of impaled people, and that seems to be the intersection, the junction, where Stoker picks up and brings the vampiric element into the story of Vlad.
Sort of freely assuming that Vlad is feasting,
right?
On the dead or something like that.
And there are some other elements too. Apparently, Vlad Dracula and his father, Vlad Dracul, were members of an organization called the Sholomons, which was a magical order. It was a kind of a underground occult society, and Stoker actually references that, not by name, but he references that he was a member of this society, and that's just icing on the cake for the character. Is this element of occultism, and if that was the case, then Stoker's probably reasoning this out. He could easily become a vampire by some sort of magical rite or alchemical rite or something that had been learned in the Sholomance. So that all these elements that Stoker is playing with, and other authors, of course, emulate these ideas as well when they're writing their own vampire stories.
So where do things like, to kill one, you drive a stake through the heart? Or you expose them to sunlight. Where does that come in here?
Well, again, we have to delve a little bit back into the folkloric element of the vampire. These apotropaics to dispatch a vampire, again, just like the idea of the vampire, are very culturally specific in many cases. Most of the ones that we see in the literary tradition stem from European folklore and European history. For instance, you mentioned the stake through the heart. Well, the heart, of course, is the mechanism that pumps blood.
Sure.
And whether you're a vampire or not, a stake through the heart is gonna dispatch you pretty quickly. But this was a treatment that was often given to corpses that were believed to have been vampires, and there were specific woods in some cases. Some are referenced like the hawthorn. Very often, varieties of the poplar. Or the aspen, members of the poplar family, Poplar tremulus. If you look at an aspen tree and the wind blows through it, you notice that the leaves it looks like it's trembling, and that's where the name comes from, Poplar tremulus. One of the traditions was that associated with this wood is that this was the variety of wood that the cross was made out of. And the reason that the poplar, the aspens, would tremble was because they did so in shame, because they were used for the cross, the crucifixion, and so this association became part of the methodology, the idea behind this sort of dispatchment. But the stake through the heart is usually the one that people think of. Of course, there are a host of other apotropaics and dispatchments as well that existed not only in Western folklore, but in world folklore as well.
Do one or two examples. How else could you get rid of a vampire?
Well, you could certainly placate a vampire. One of the traditions was you could take seeds or millet or wheat or something like that.
Is this the small object thing?
Yes, they're apparently those Eastern European vampires were obsessive compulsive. And if you just dump all your seeds or whatever you have out, they have no choice but to count every last breathing one of them. So that would be one method. Of course, holy water would be a later iteration as well, and holy water, of course, being associated with the Catholic Church and its sacrality, was thought to be something that would be able to wound or fend off a vampire. So even from these three examples here, you can see that there's a variety of dispatchments and apotropaics.
And there seems to be like, okay, this is an evil thing, so to get rid of an evil thing, I'm going to go over to this holy thing.
Sure.
You know, that's kind of obvious too. There's that sort of idea, you know, working.
Evil,
well.
and even in some cases, maybe not evil, but mundane too. Something that's apart from the sacred. You know, the vampires and werewolves and things like that are earthy kinds of creatures. They're associated with animals and the earth and lowly things. So, yeah, it is the evil element, but in some cases it's also the earthy element as well.
Mm-hmm. So what has accrued to all that isn't Stoker or Tepish, you know, today? Because a lot of these things, again, that we think of seem to, you know, the roads seem to go back to one of those two sources. Is there anything that's kind of an outlier? Because, I mean, nowadays, you know, vampires are portrayed as sort of, you know, suave and gentlemanly, and, you know, even there's this attraction factor. You know, then you get the Twilight novels, which are something really altogether different, you know, in a number of respects. So does that stuff come from anywhere, or is that just Hollywood creativity?
Well, all of the authors and filmmakers and what have you are really sort of working in the wake of Stoker. They're molding off of a model that he put together. As you say now, vampires are more anti-hero, suave anti-hero. But even that, there's the element of the European nobleman in that. But what seems to have changed on a popular level is that we no longer see many authors vilifying vampires, whereas that was very clearly what they were. They were demonized and the antagonists in these novels like Barney the Vampire and of course Stoker's Dracula. Where does actual history intersect with this? I'm familiar with people, I guess it would be 18th, 19th century. They would encounter corpses or, you know, various, you know, corpses that had been dead for X number of days or weeks or whatever it was. And I've read enough to know that they would often find blood still in the body that seemed fresh. And you wouldn't think that would be the case. And so they would draw what to them was an obvious conclusion that this dead body must be reanimated in some way and goes out and seeks blood and sustains its existence in some way. And so, I mean, they don't have the scientific knowledge of decomposition that we do. So I could see where this is kind of a logical conclusion, but how do you get from one thing to the other? I mean, what's the role of such misidentifications, you know, in the bigger picture of the folklore here? I think to a degree you have to allow for an amount of that sort of misidentification. There are things we know about pathology and the post-mortem nature of decomposition in the human body now that weren't known. What I find interesting about that period that you mentioned, particularly the 18th century, you also have the age of reason at that time, the age of enlightenment, when empiricism and quantification become more important in our intellectual endeavors. And what's interesting to me is that you have this interesting nexus of the old folklore intersecting with these new methods of quantification. A lot of the reports coming out of the 1600s and 1700s and 1800s, yes, you have the anecdotal, you know, folkloric traditions that exist, but you've also got, you know, army officers and, you know, educated individuals, surgeons, who are making these reports as well. So we actually have a good amount of data from these periods about vampirism because of the up-and-coming empiricism, the methods that are being used to record observable phenomena. But again, misidentification has to be taken into account because, again, there were things about pathology and medicine that we simply didn't know at that time that we do now. That would, you know, we know that hair continues to grow for a while after death. We know that nails do.
Mm-hmm.
We know that the gums and skin begin to pull back.
Yeah, that would like expose
Sure,
the teeth.
sure.
Yeah.
Well, and gases build up in the body too, and people claim to hear sounds,
Okay.
Under the ground, in a grave or something.
Right.
Well, these gases,
Yeah, you could see how people would encounter those things and just draw certain conclusions very easily.
Very easily, yes, yes. That's not to discount that there's a spiritual element
Mm-hmm.
to this, and that people don't have real experiences with vampiric spirits. I think that's a reality, particularly for people that subscribe to a Judeo-Christian worldview. I think you have to consider the possibility
Mm-hmm.
that demons can use all manner of these culturally specific ideas.
When we come back, I want to go down that road, because you also brought up this sort of amoral, portrayal now.
Mm-hmm.
So when we come back next time, I want to hit, both of these. Like, do you see any sort of overlap, again, with this topic and a biblical worldview? And then what about, again, how things are portrayed? Do you think there's something behind? Is that a trend? Is there something behind a trend, if it is a trend?
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I want to hit next time. So thanks again for being with us.
My pleasure.
Yeah. And thank you all for watching Fringe Pop 321. Please visit our website for the companion web page to this episode and all of our episodes, fringepop321.com. And to support us, go to fp321.com/S, as in the letter S. And please come back and watch some more episodes, because what you know may not be so.